about to possibly get murdered.
At first, it sounded like every family's worst nightmare. A frantic 911 call, a young man bleeding, a father shot, a masked intruder disappearing into the dark. In a quiet, affluent neighborhood in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where violence felt distant and doors were rarely locked, police were told a stranger had invaded a home and executed an entire family. A home where nothing seemed broken, nothing stolen, nothing disturbed, except the people inside. Within minutes, officers realized they weren't walking into a routine crime scene. They were stepping into something far darker, a house where 3 family members lay dead in different rooms, a weapon that didn't belong to any outsider, surveillance cameras that worked everywhere, except where the killer supposedly entered, and a survivor whose story sounded right until it didn't. As detectives peeled back the layers, every detail that once pointed to an intruder began pointing inward. The evidence didn't scream chaos, it whispered planning, familiarity, intent. This is not just a story about a family annihilated in their own home. It is a story about deception, about how a carefully staged lie can collapse under the weight of science, logic, and patience, and how sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one asking for help. What really happened inside the Jackson home that morning, and how long can the truth stay hidden when every detail is working against it? The emergency call came in just after 8 a.m. The dispatcher's voice was calm, practiced, the kind of tone built for chaos. "County Sheriff, where is your emergency?" On the other end of the line was a young man struggling to breathe. "I've been shot," he said. "My other family member has been shot. I need help immediately." The caller identified himself as Alexander Jackson. His voice shook as he explained that he had been hit in the foot by a bullet while his father lay gravely wounded inside their home. Somewhere in the house, he said. His sister was still hiding in her bedroom. The dispatcher immediately went into protocol. "What happened?" "There was a man," Alex replied. "He came down and shot us." A man. An intruder. According to Alex, a stranger had broken into their house, found the family's gun, and opened fire before fleeing out the back door. He couldn't give a clear description, just that the person was male, wearing black, possibly with a mask. The answers were vague, but in moments like this, shock explains a lot. And if Alex was telling the truth, officers were racing toward an active threat scenario, an armed suspect loose in one of Cedar Rapids' safest neighborhoods. Patrol cars flooded the quiet cul-de-sac within minutes. As deputies approached the Jackson home, something already felt wrong. There were no open doors, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. Still, officers knocked, announcing themselves. When they entered, they found Alex sitting near the basement stairs, his socks soaked in blood. He was alive, injured, shaken. Then he pointed toward the living room. That's when they saw Jan Jackson. Jan lay motionless on the floor, a rifle beside his body. The wounds were obvious. Officers didn't need confirmation. He was already gone. What had initially sounded like a home invasion was instantly escalating into something far worse. As police moved through the house, they found Sabrina, Alex's 19-year-old sister, dead in her bedroom. She had been shot twice. Upstairs in the master bedroom, they found Melissa, Alex's mother. She, too, had been shot, twice in the head. 3 family members, 3 separate rooms, all killed with precision. This was no chaotic break-in. This was a methodical execution. Yet the house itself looked almost untouched. Furniture was in place, no drawers pulled open, no valuables missing. A half-finished puzzle sat calmly on a table nearby, undisturbed. The only visible signs of violence were the bodies and the shell casings scattered throughout the home. And then there was the weapon, a Browning .22 rifle, owned by the Jackson family. Investigators quickly realized something critical about this gun. It wasn't simple to operate. Loading and reloading it required specific knowledge. In fact, one officer later admitted he had to look up instructions just to understand how it worked. Yet whoever fired it had discharged more than 11 rounds, meaning the weapon had been reloaded at least twice. That detail mattered. If an intruder had entered the house unarmed, located this specific rifle, figured out how to load it, moved room to room killing 3 people, reloaded the weapon, and then vanished without leaving a single trace, it would be one of the most improbable crimes Iowa had ever seen. Alex was transported to the hospital for treatment. During the ambulance ride, he talked, freely, continuously, without being prompted. He repeated his story again and again. He said he had been asleep on the screened-in porch with his dog when he heard gunshots. He ran inside and saw a masked man standing near his father with the rifle. He rushed the attacker, struggled with him, and was shot in the foot. The man then fled out the back door. The version stayed consistent, but the details never got clearer. At the hospital, detectives began asking routine questions. What time did you go to bed? Around 11? Where were you sleeping? On the porch. Why the porch? I sleep there sometimes. Who else was home? My mom, dad, sister? Anything unusual the night before? No. Everything was normal. The answers were simple, almost too simple. What stood out wasn't just what Alex said, but how he said it. He appeared calm. Distressed, yes, but not devastated, not frantic, not consumed by grief in the way most people would be after losing their entire family. When asked about his mother, Alex responded by describing her photography skills. She's really good, he said. It was an odd response. No one had asked. Back at the house, investigators were beginning to notice problems with Alex's account. The Jackson home had surveillance cameras covering nearly every angle of the property. Every camera had been recording that morning. Every camera except one, the camera that would have captured the back door, the exact exit Alex said the intruder used, had been turned off. No footage of anyone entering. No footage of anyone leaving. A K-9 unit was brought in to track the suspect's scent. The dog found nothing. No trail through yards. No path through nearby woods. No sign of a fleeing person. Then detectives canvassed the neighborhood. In a cul-de-sac where people noticed everything, not a single neighbor reported seeing a stranger. No unfamiliar vehicles, no masked man running, no disturbance at all. Each piece of missing evidence made the intruder theory harder to believe. And then came the blood evidence. Crime scene analysts found blood not only near the basement stairs, but inside Alex's bedroom. Bloody footprints led from his room into the hallway and up the stairs. There were no footprints leading into his room. That meant Alex had been shot inside his bedroom, not during a struggle in the living room like he claimed. Why would an intruder shoot Alex in his bedroom, allow him to walk away, and then leave him alive? Why spare the only adult male in the house while killing everyone else with ruthless efficiency? And why did Alex never attempt to help his family? He didn't check on his father, who lay just feet away. He didn't go upstairs to see if his mother or sister were alive. He called 911 and waited. At the hospital, detectives began to gently push back. They told Alex there was no evidence of an intruder, no video, no scent, no witnesses. They asked him one final time, "Do you want us to write in our report that there was a man in your house, even though there's no evidence he was ever there?" Alex paused. "I want to go now," he said. When asked directly who hurt his family, his answer was immediate. "It's not me." But by that point, detectives weren't asking anymore. They were listening for the moment the story finally collapsed. And it was coming. By the time detectives finished processing the Jackson home, the idea of a random intruder was already falling apart. Piece by piece, the scene told a story that Alex's words could not support. The first major crack came from phone records. Alex had told investigators he was asleep on the porch until he heard gunshots around 8:00 a.m. He claimed he hadn't been awake, hadn't been on his phone, hadn't noticed anything unusual before the attack. But his phone data told a different story. At 6:00 a.m., more than 2 hours before the alleged break-in, Alex was awake and actively using his phone. He was scrolling, messaging, and online. He wasn't asleep. He wasn't disconnected from the world. So why lie about that? Then came the blood evidence, and this is where the intruder narrative truly collapsed. Crime scene analysts mapped every drop, smear, and footprint inside the house. The results were impossible to ignore. The blood trail showed Alex had been shot inside his bedroom, near the corner of his bed. From there, bloody footprints led out into the hallway and down the stairs. There were no signs of a struggle in the living room, no blood spatter consistent with a fight, no evidence of a chaotic confrontation. If Alex had been shot while wrestling an intruder downstairs, as he claimed, his blood should have been there. It wasn't. That meant something else entirely. It meant Alex had been alone when he was shot, and it meant he had walked himself out of his bedroom afterward. Investigators also examined Alex's injury more closely. The gunshot wound to his foot was painful, but not severe. It was clean, controlled, non-lethal. Meanwhile, Jan had been shot 5 times. Sabrina had been shot twice, including once near the eye. Melissa had been shot twice, both bullets entering her brain. 3 people were executed with precision. Alex, the only survivor, had a single survivable wound. That imbalance mattered. It suggested intent, control, selection. And then there was the weapon. The Browning 22 rifle had fired more than 11 rounds, requiring at least 2 reloads. This wasn't a spray of panic shots. Someone had deliberately reloaded and continued. Investigators tried loading the rifle themselves. It wasn't intuitive, it wasn't quick, it wasn't something a stranger would easily figure out under pressure. This was a gun that favored familiarity. Fingerprints on the rifle added another layer. 2 prints were recovered. One clearly belonged to Alex. The other was partial, too degraded to identify, but forensic experts believed it was likely also his, just without enough ridge detail to confirm. There were no unknown fingerprints, no intruder DNA, no foreign fibers, no shoe prints outside the house. Nothing. As the evidence mounted, detectives returned to Alex for another interview, this time more direct. They walked him through the facts. No surveillance footage of anyone entering or leaving. No canine scent trail, no witnesses. Blood evidence contradicting his story. They told him plainly, there is no evidence anyone else was here. Alex grew quiet, then defensive. He repeated the same explanation, again and again, despite the contradictions. There was a man. He wore a mask. He left. Detectives pressed harder. If someone broke in to commit murder, they would likely bring a weapon. But instead, this person supposedly found the family rifle, learned how to load it, killed 3 people in separate rooms, reloaded it multiple times, shot Alex but spared his life, turned off one specific camera, avoided all others, left no trace, and vanished into a neighborhood where no one saw or heard a thing. That wasn't just unlikely, it was implausible. At one point, a detective laid it out bluntly. Do you want our report to say there was a guy in your house when there's no evidence of a guy? Alex asked to leave. Then came the question that changed everything. You know who hurt your family? Alex hesitated, then said, Not really. The detective didn't back down. There wasn't a guy, Alex. Silence. Then Alex spoke again. It's not me. But by now, detectives weren't debating if Alex was involved. They were figuring out why. Investigators began digging into Alex's personal life. On the surface, he looked like the last person capable of something like this. He had been an Eagle Scout, a good student, quiet, no criminal history, no record of violence, but there were pressures building beneath that image. Alex had dropped out of college. He wasn't working. He had no income, just $30 to his name. His father, Jan, had recently told him he needed to get a job or move out. It wasn't a screaming match, it wasn't explosive, it was worse, it was final. Financial records revealed something else. The Jackson family was well off. Their assets, including the home, were valued at nearly $2 million. If Alex were the sole surviving heir, everything would pass to him. That didn't prove motive, but it established opportunity. Investigators also reviewed journals kept by Sabrina. They revealed frequent arguments between her and Alex, often ideological, sometimes personal. Nothing violent, but enough tension to suggest a fractured household behind closed doors. Still, motive alone wasn't enough. What sealed the case was how the evidence aligned perfectly with one explanation and one explanation only. Alex knew the house. Alex knew the gun. Alex knew where everyone slept. Alex knew how to move through the home without disruption. And Alex was the only person whose story required the laws of probability to break. After months of investigation, prosecutors made their move. Alex Jackson was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. A year and a half later, the case went to trial. And that's when the story Alex tried to sell finally met the full weight of the facts, laid out piece by piece in front of a jury. When the trial of Alexander Jackson finally began, Cedar Rapids filled the courtroom seats with a quiet, uneasy tension. This was not just another murder case. This was a triple homicide inside a family home, committed, prosecutors argued, by the only person left alive. From the very first day, the prosecution made their position clear. There was no intruder, no masked man, no home invasion. There was only Alex. They opened by walking the jury through the morning of the killings, replaying the 911 call where Alex calmly described a stranger who could never be found. Prosecutors emphasized how quickly the intruder story collapsed under scrutiny, and how every single piece of physical evidence pointed inward, not outward. Then they began laying out the case methodically. First came the surveillance footage. Jurors saw video from nearly every camera around the Jackson home. The footage showed no one entering the property, no one leaving, no suspicious movement at all. Then prosecutors pointed out the one missing angle, the backdoor camera that had been manually disabled. They asked the jury to consider a simple question. How would a random intruder know exactly which camera to turn off? Next came the phone records. The prosecution showed that Alex had been awake and active on his phone at 6 a.m., long before he claimed to have been asleep. They argued this wasn't a mistake, it was a deliberate lie designed to push the timeline closer to the 911 call and away from any planning. Then came the blood evidence. Crime scene analysts testified in detail, explaining how Alex's blood trail originated in his bedroom, not the living room. Jurors saw photographs of footprints leading from his room into the hallway, then down the stairs. The prosecution made their point unmistakably clear. Alex did not get shot during a struggle with an intruder. He was shot alone. Medical experts then described the injuries in chilling precision. Jan Jackson, 5 gunshot wounds. Sabrina Jackson, 2 gunshot wounds, including one near the eye. Melissa Jackson, 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Each victim had been shot at close range. Each killing was deliberate. And then there was Alex, 1 shot to the foot, non-lethal, controlled. The prosecution argued that Alex had shot himself intentionally to create the illusion of a struggle and to place himself in the role of victim rather than perpetrator. The murder weapon was next. Experts explained to the jury how the Browning .22 rifle functioned and how unintuitive it was to load. They testified that the weapon had fired more than 11 rounds, meaning the shooter had to reload at least twice. This was not a panicked rampage. This was methodical. Prosecutors also highlighted the fingerprints found on the rifle, one clearly belonging to Alex and another partial print consistent with him as well. No foreign DNA, no unknown fingerprints, no trace of anyone else. Then came motive. The prosecution did not claim rage or insanity. Instead, they painted a quieter picture, one of pressure and entitlement. Alex had dropped out of college. He wasn't working. He had no money. His father had told him it was time to take responsibility or leave. The family, meanwhile, had substantial assets. If Alex were the sole survivor, he stood to inherit everything. The prosecution was careful here. They didn't say money was the only reason. They said it was the opportunity. When the defense took over, their strategy was clear: doubt. They accused investigators of tunnel vision. They argued that police had focused on Alex too early and ignored other possibilities. They pointed to the unidentified partial fingerprint as proof that someone else could have been involved. They suggested the lack of evidence didn't prove Alex's guilt. It simply meant the intruder was careful. They reminded jurors that Alex had no criminal history, no known violence, no documented mental illness, and they leaned heavily on one idea: why would someone murder their entire family for no clear reason? But the prosecution anticipated that question. In rebuttal, they reminded jurors that motive does not have to make sense, it only has to exist, and they emphasized the simplest truth of all: if an intruder had committed these murders, there would be evidence. There was none. Then came the interrogation footage. Jurors watched Alex as detectives confronted him with contradictions. They saw his demeanor, flat, detached, oddly composed. They heard his story shift subtly under pressure, and they heard the moment when the intruder narrative finally cracked. There wasn't a guy, a detective told him. Alex didn't argue. He only said, "It's not me." After closing arguments, the jury deliberated. It took them just over 5 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The verdict was read: guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Alex showed no visible reaction, no tears, no shock, no collapse, just the same blank expression. At sentencing, the judge addressed him directly. He spoke about the devastation to the community, about the rarity of such a crime, about the irreversible loss of 3 innocent lives. Then he delivered the sentence: 3 life sentences, to be served consecutively. Alex Jackson, at just 20 years old, would spend the rest of his life in prison, and because of Iowa law, he would not inherit a single dollar from his parents' estate. Afterward, the prosecutor summed up the case in a statement that captured what so many felt. This was an inexplicable, unjustified, senseless murder. Even with convictions, nothing can explain why. And that is what lingers. The evidence answered how. The verdict answered who. But the question of why remains. Why did a young man with every opportunity choose annihilation? Why did a family that appeared stable, private, and ordinary become the site of such calculated violence? There is no satisfying explanation, only the truth that sometimes the most horrifying crimes don't come from monsters hiding in the dark, but from people sitting at the breakfast table, waiting for the moment no one expects. The Jackson family case stands as one of the most disturbing crimes in Iowa's recent history, not just for its brutality, but for its emptiness. 3 lives ended, 1 life destroyed, and a silence where answers should be. Long after the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied, Cedar Rapids was left with something heavier than closure. People returned to their routines, streets stayed quiet, lawns were still trimmed, but the Jackson home never felt like just another house again. For many in the community, it became a reminder that safety can be an illusion, and that violence doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile what they thought they knew with what the evidence revealed. Alex Jackson had not fit the picture people associate with family annihilators. He wasn't known to be violent, he wasn't loud, he wasn't erratic. That, perhaps, is what made the case so unsettling. There was no dramatic explosion, no public breakdown, no history of abuse that screamed danger. Instead, there was quiet pressure, silent resentment, a young man drifting without direction, facing expectations he couldn't meet and consequences he didn't want to accept. In court, victim impact statements painted a fuller picture of what was lost. John Jackson was remembered as a provider who worked hard and cared deeply about his children's futures. Melissa Jackson was described as creative, gentle, and warm, someone who preserved other families' memories through her photography. Sabrina, just 19, was spoken of as intelligent, driven, and full of promise, with her entire life ahead of her. 3 lives, reduced to evidence folders and crime scene photos, and 1 son who would never again be part of the world he destroyed. Psychologists and criminologists who later analyzed the case offered theories: failure to launch, entitlement, fear of losing control, but no theory fully explains how someone crosses that line. How a thought becomes a plan, how a plan becomes action. That unanswered why is often the hardest part for families and communities left behind. The legal system did what it could. The jury weighed the facts. The judge imposed the harshest sentence allowed. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. But justice does not bring understanding, and it does not bring peace. The Jackson family case now exists as a permanent record, a cautionary story told in courtrooms, classrooms, and true crime discussions. Not because it was sensational, but because it was disturbingly ordinary until it wasn't. A reminder that darkness doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly, waiting, and when it finally surfaces, the damage is irreversible. Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, pressure, and the signs we may never see coming. If you want more deeply researched stories that go beyond headlines and dig into what really happened, stay with us and keep asking the questions that matter.